On October 27, 1943, the United States Navy commissioned a destroyer it would lose in exactly 1 year. That is the official record. 1 year, 0 days. The Navy called it a general-purpose combatant, fast enough to evade threats, small enough to avoid submarine targeting priorities, agile enough to outmaneuver anything that could kill it. Personnel assignment boards treated destroyer billets as desirable postings, lower mortality risk than carrier aviation, safer than submarine service, cleaner than amphibious infantry. That was the official version. Here is the number the official version did not include. Of the roughly 340 destroyers that saw active Pacific combat between December 1941 and September 1945, the United States Navy lost 71 to enemy action. 1 in 5 never came home. The men who climbed aboard Fletcher-class destroyers in 1942 were stepping onto one of the most statistically lethal platforms the Navy put to sea, in a ship the institution had quietly classified as expendable. USS Johnston, hull number 557, was one of them. This is what it cost to be aboard her. Before the battle, there was the machine. A Fletcher-class destroyer measured 376 feet from bow to stern. At full combat load, she displaced 2,500 tons. 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers fed 60,000 shaft horsepower through 2 General Electric turbines, enough to drive her through open Pacific at 38 knots. 60,000 horsepower lived in the engineering spaces. The men who tended those boilers worked in compartments where the ambient temperature during tropical operations routinely exceeded 120 degrees Fahrenheit, nearly 50 degrees Celsius. A ruptured steam line in that environment could scald a man to death in under 4 seconds. The engineering watch did not track the temperature on a gauge. They tracked it through their own bodies. How fast the sweat soaked through a uniform, how quickly hands stopped gripping tools properly, how a man who had been on watch for 2 hours began making the small errors that 4 hours of that heat turned into serious ones. The hull plating was 19 millimeters of high-tensile steel, less than 3/4 of an inch, thin enough that a Japanese 25-millimeter anti-aircraft round, the same caliber fired from Zero fighters, could punch through both sides of a destroyer's superstructure without detonating. The armor that theoretically separated the crew from the Pacific was thinner than a car door. That was the machine they lived in. The official mission list for a Fletcher in 1942 covered anti-submarine warfare, torpedo attacks, carrier screening, shore bombardment, mine laying, mine sweeping, rescue operations, and high-speed troop transport. In practice, destroyer commanders in the Pacific received all of these missions simultaneously, often in the same 24-hour period, with a crew that hadn't slept more than 4 consecutive hours in the previous week. Fatigue was the first enemy. It arrived before the Japanese did. A Fletcher-class destroyer maintained 4-hour watch rotations around the clock. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, in theory. In practice, the 8 hours off collapsed the moment general quarters sounded. And in the waters around the Philippines in 1944, general quarters did not sound occasionally. It was the rhythm of the day. The forward berthing compartments on Johnston held men in 3-tier pipe frame racks jammed into every available cubic foot of the bow section. The clearance between tiers was approximately 45 centimeters, 18 inches, from the surface of one mattress to the frame of the rack above it. A man who wanted to turn over in his sleep had to plan the maneuver in advance. The bow was the worst place on a destroyer in any kind of sea. Physics put the most violent motion there, the greatest upward pitch as the bow climbed a wave, the hardest downward slam as it came through. Junior ratings birthed forward not because the Navy wanted to be cruel, but because seniority governed berthing assignments. The men who had been aboard longest had already moved aft. A man 3 weeks aboard slept in the bow. A man who had survived 3 invasions slept somewhere quieter. The hierarchy was real. The physical difference was measurable every night. After 96 hours of severe sleep restriction, reaction time degrades to the equivalent of a blood alcohol level of 0.1%. Vigilance tasks, the kind required to track contacts on a radar scope, hold a fire control solution, monitor a sonar return, collapse entirely. The men operating Johnston's most critical electronic systems were physiologically impaired, not from any failure of character, simply because human biology has a ceiling, and the operational tempo had gone through it weeks earlier. They stood their watches anyway. Fresh water on a Fletcher was rationed with the precision of a system that understood exactly how little it had. Drinking first, cooking second, machinery cooling third. Bathing was not on the list. It did not exist. In tropical Pacific heat, ambient air above 95 degrees Fahrenheit, the engineering spaces running 25 degrees above that, 300 men who had not bathed in weeks produced a specific atmospheric reality in the berthing compartments that no official specification ever attempted to describe. The Navy's own medical reports from the period used the clinical term tropical dermatitis. The men who lived in it used different words. The skin conditions that developed after 2 weeks of salt water without freshwater rinsing were not minor discomforts. Open sores formed along collar lines, waistbands, anywhere fabric rubbed salt-crusted skin repeatedly against itself. The pharmacist's mate treated them with whatever the medical kit contained. By the 3rd week at sea, the kit was always running short of something. Dental care aboard Johnston was limited to extractions. No fillings, no cleaning, no preventive treatment of any kind. The pharmacist's mate performed extractions with a manual forceps and a bottle of lidocaine at a folding table in the battle dressing station, a compartment approximately the size of a large closet. After 6 months of combined saltwater diet, disrupted sleep, and no dental care, crew surveys from this period showed cavity rates approaching 80% among enlisted men. Men pulled their own teeth during extended deployments, not in desperation, in practicality, because the pain was interfering with their ability to stand watch. Food followed the same logic of scarcity that governed everything else aboard. Johnston's commissary officer was allocated provisions for 30 days, fresh provisions for the first 10. After 10 days, the fresh provisions were gone. Eggs powdered, meat canned, milk powdered, bread baked aboard, but the flour in tropical humidity developed weevils after 2 weeks at sea, and standing orders were to sift but not discard the affected flour. There was no replacement coming. Men operating machinery at full tempo in 120-degree engineering spaces on 2,200 calories per day lost weight at rates that would have been considered medically dangerous in any peacetime context. An engineering watch rating who reported aboard Johnston at 170 pounds in the spring of 1944 weighed substantially less by October. The body adapted. Or it didn't. Either way, the watch continued. a man losing 2 to 3 kilograms of body weight per watch purely through sweat, working in gloves because bare hands blistered on the valve handles, making decisions about machinery that kept 300 men alive. That man was entitled, by Navy regulation, to 8 hours off when his watch ended. He was averaging under 90 minutes of uninterrupted sleep. The regulations and the reality were operating in different oceans. The ship's medical officer, a lieutenant junior grade who in most cases had completed exactly 1 year of general practice before commissioning, treated whatever came through the hatch of that closet-sized battle dressing station with what he had. 1 medical officer, 1 pharmacist's mate, morphine in small emergency kits distributed to chief petty officers, blood plasma in limited quantities, no blood bank, no surgeon. The Bureau of Medicine and Surgery's post-war study documented what this meant in numbers. For men who survived long enough to receive treatment aboard ship, mortality from penetrating abdominal wounds ran at approximately 78%. For burns covering more than 30% of body surface, mortality exceeded 90%. These figures did not appear in recruiting materials. The moments between watches were not rest in any civilian sense of that word. They were the absence of immediate duty, which is a different thing entirely. A man with 4 hours off on a destroyer in the tropics in 1944 had a choice of locations that amounted to no real choice. The berthing compartment was hot and airless, loud with the sounds of machinery passing through the hull. The weather deck was exposed to sun and spray. The spaces between, passageways, mess compartments, small areas around equipment housings, were occupied by other men doing exactly what he was doing, existing in the gap between one watch and the next. The crew of a Fletcher-class destroyer was 273 men. The ship was 376 feet long. That works out to roughly 1.5 men per foot of hull. In practice, it meant that privacy was not a concept that applied to life aboard Johnston. Every space was someone's station, someone's sleeping area, someone's path to somewhere else. The closest thing to solitude available to an enlisted man at sea was standing at the stern rail after dark, when the wake was the only light, and the ocean was the only thing moving at the same scale as the darkness. Most men didn't seek solitude anyway. What they sought, what the oral histories of destroyer crews from this period returned to consistently, was conversation. Not about the war, not about tactics or missions, about home, about places and people that existed outside the steel hull and the Pacific Ocean, and the operational tempo that consumed every waking hour the Navy could schedule. A quartermaster who served on USS Franks, a sister ship that operated alongside Johnston in the Solomons in the spring of 1944, described it plainly. The biggest recreation they had was just shooting the breeze. They talked about liberties, past and future, about their families, about sports, about the life they had left behind and expected to return to. It was the same on Johnston. The geography varied: Kwajalein, Bougainville, Guam, the Palaus, but the conversations at the stern rail were the same conversations. The same few people talked about. The same futures mapped in the dark, with the same absence of certainty about whether any of it would happen. Writing letters home was complicated by the censorship requirement. Every letter had to be reviewed by an officer before mailing, with any reference to location, operations, or ship movements removed or blacked out. The men had learned to write letters that said nothing specific about where they were or what they were doing, which left them writing about themselves, their health, and asking questions about home that would take 6 to 8 weeks to receive answers to. The gap between asking and receiving was wide enough to contain the entire arc of a family event. A man could ask about his wife's pregnancy in July and not know the outcome until September. He could send birthday greetings in August and not know if they had arrived by November. The letter that came in October might have been written in June, about a situation that had already resolved itself in ways the writer hadn't anticipated. Men learned to read between the lines of letters from home, to notice what wasn't said. The ship's library on a Fletcher consisted of whatever paperback novels had been left aboard by previous crews, plus whatever men had brought themselves. The books degraded rapidly in tropical humidity. Pages stuck together, then tore when separated. Covers separated from spines after 3 or 4 readings. By the 3rd month at sea, the library was a collection of loose pages organized by no system anyone had agreed on. Men read them anyway. A loose section of someone else's novel, missing its first 40 pages and its last 30, was still a story. Still a window into a world that had walls that weren't made of steel and air that didn't smell of diesel and machinery oil. The men who borrowed the damaged books didn't complain about the missing sections. They filled them in themselves. Johnston's nickname was GQ Johnny. Not an affectionate nickname, an accurate one. The ship's general quarters alarm was the auditory backdrop against which everything else aboard happened. Drills during daylight, actual contacts at night, air raid warnings that could mean an incoming attack, or could mean a radar operator had mistracked a friendly aircraft or a flock of birds moving through the scope at altitude. The crew learned to move from horizontal to battle station in a state that was not quite awake. The body developed its own protocol. Hear the alarm, stand, dress while moving, arrive. The mind could remain several seconds behind the body, and the job still got done. After enough repetitions, the separation between sleeping and standing watch narrowed to the point where men could no longer reliably tell, in the first 30 seconds after the alarm, whether they had been asleep. They stood their stations anyway. Johnston's war diary recorded only twice in 12 months of operations that the crew was allowed to set Condition 4 watches, the lightest watch condition, permitting maximum rest. The first time was at Majuro Atoll in early March of 1944, after the Marshall Islands campaign. The war diarist recorded it as the first occasion since the ship had left San Diego that the crew could enjoy what he called, with the careful understatement of official documents, some relaxation and recreation. 6 days later, they were underway again. The second was a 2-day availability period alongside the repair ship Briareus in August of 1944, which the war diarist described as insufficient for routine repair work, let alone for crew rest. Between those 2 entries, Johnston had been at 2 invasions, 3 major bombardment operations, an anti-submarine patrol that ended with the sinking of I-176, and weeks of carrier screening duty across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean. Twice in 12 months. The physical world of the ship imposed itself on the body in ways that accumulated below the surface of what official records measured. The noise was constant, machinery, water against the hull, the ventilation system that moved hot air through the berthing spaces without meaningfully cooling it. The motion was constant, varying in amplitude with the sea state, but never stopping. A man who had spent 6 months aboard a destroyer in Pacific operations had adapted to the motion so completely that he could no longer feel it consciously. What he could feel was its absence. Men who returned to shore leave reported that the ground felt wrong, that they found themselves bracing for a roll that didn't come, that they woke in hotel beds because the stillness felt like something had stopped that should still be running. The ship had become the baseline. Everything else was what needed explanation. What the body could not fully adapt to was the accumulated weight of the noise, the heat, the sleep deprivation, and the specific knowledge that the ship could stop existing at any moment. Not as abstraction, as a statistical reality that had been demonstrated repeatedly to every man aboard by the names of ships they had known that were no longer afloat. The men who were good at managing this knowledge managed it through mastery of their station, the exact mechanics of their mount, the exact behavior of sonar returns in this particular water temperature, the exact sound a boiler made when pressure was approaching the point that required attention. The knowledge that they were the expert, that the ship needed their specific expertise to function, that their watch mattered in a direct and immediate way. This was not comfort exactly, but it was something to put in the space where comfort wasn't available. The man who commanded Johnston understood what he was commanding. Commander Ernest Evans was 35 years old when Johnston was commissioned at Tacoma, Washington, on October 27, 1943. He was Cherokee, born poor in Oklahoma, enlisted in the Navy in 1926, spent a year as an enlisted man before talking his way into the Naval Academy, graduated in 1931. His classmates called him the Chief. Not to his face, never to his face, but behind his back, with the specific warmth of men who recognized something in him that the rank structure had no word for. At Johnston's commissioning ceremony, Evans stood before his crew and said, "This is going to be a fighting ship. I intend to go in harm's way, and anyone who doesn't want to go along had better get off right now." No one got off. 3 months later, Johnston was bombarding the beaches of Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands, then Eniwetok, then anti-submarine patrols through the Solomons, where in May of 1944 she hunted and sank the Japanese submarine Ward 176 off Bougainville, a 3-destroyer coordinated attack, Johnston delivering the final depth charges. Then Guam, where she put more than 4,000 rounds of naval gunfire into Japanese positions across 9 days of bombardment. Then the Palos, then the Philippines. 4 invasions. 1 year. 0 days to spare. On October 20th, 1944, 5 days before the battle, Johnston joined Task Unit 77.4.3. Call sign Taffy 3. 6 escort carriers, 3 destroyers, 4 destroyer escorts. Their mission was to provide air support for MacArthur's landing on Leyte, rear area work, the kind of assignment that should not have required Johnston to fire a single gun in anger. The night of October 24th, Evans stood on the bridge listening to radio traffic from the naval battle in Surigao Strait to the south. He turned to his gunnery officer, Lieutenant Robert Hagen, and said, "Well, Hagen, we're within 3 days of being 1 year old. It's been an uneventful year." 4 invasions. He meant it anyway. At 6:37 on the morning of October 25th, a scout pilot flying the dawn patrol broke radio silence with a contact report. 4 battleships, 8 cruisers, 11 destroyers, bearing northwest, distance less than 20 miles. Steaming directly toward Taffy 3. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita's center force, the same fleet American intelligence had reported retreating after air attacks the previous day, had reversed course during the night. passed undetected through San Bernardino Strait, and was now closing on 6 escort carriers and their thin screen at 23 knots. Yamato was with them. 72,000 tons, 9 18-inch guns, the largest naval rifles ever mounted on a warship. Each of Yamato's 3 main turrets, standing alone, weighed more than 2,700 tons. A single turret on Yamato weighed more than the entire USS Johnston. Hagen, Johnston's gunnery officer, later wrote what he felt when the radar contacts resolved into fleet units at close range. "We felt like little David without a slingshot." Evans did not wait for orders from Sprague. He did not call a staff discussion. He did not signal the formation for guidance. He looked at the radar scope, looked at the carriers behind him, and gave a single order. "All engines ahead flank. Commence making smoke. Prepare to attack." Johnston turned northwest. Not away. Toward. For the first 20 minutes, Johnston ran straight at the Japanese fleet and could not fire a single round. Her 5-inch guns had an effective range of roughly 10 miles. The nearest Japanese cruisers were beyond that range and closing. In those 20 minutes, Johnston was receiving fire she had no means of returning: 8-inch shells from the cruisers, 14-inch rounds from the battleships, all landing close enough that the ship was zigzagging constantly between the shell splashes, chasing the misses. Because the Japanese were unlikely to fire twice at the same patch of ocean. When the range closed to 10 miles, Evans opened fire on Kumano, the heavy cruiser at the head of the Japanese formation. In 5 minutes, Johnston put more than 200 rounds into Kumano's superstructure. 40 confirmed hits. The 54-pound shells were tearing through everything above the waterline: gun directors, rangefinders, crew on open decks, without penetrating to vital spaces below. That was not the point. The point was the range. At 9,000 yards, 5 miles, Evans ordered the torpedo attack. All 10 Mark 15 torpedoes fired in a single spread. Johnston turned hard to put her smokescreen between herself and the Japanese, and when she came back out of her own smoke less than a minute later, Kumano was burning from the bow. One torpedo had struck forward and detonated with enough force to nearly sever the cruiser's bow. Kumano fell out of formation. Suzuya, a second heavy cruiser, broke off to assist. 2 heavy cruisers, nearly 40,000 tons of warship combined, removed from the pursuit of Taffy 3 by 10 torpedoes, from 1 destroyer. Then came what the attack cost. 3 14-inch shells from the battleship Congo struck Johnston at 7:30. 14-inch naval shells. Each one weighed 1,500 pounds, each one moving at 2,000 feet per second. Hagen described what it felt like when they hit. It was like a puppy being smacked by a truck. The 3 shells took out the port engine room, the fire room, and the after section simultaneously. 1 boiler room destroyed. Speed dropped from 38 knots to 17. Power to the steering engine. Gone. Power to the 3 rear 5-inch gun mounts. Gone. The gyro compass. Gone. 3 6-inch shells followed within seconds, striking the bridge. Fires ignited in the ready ammunition locker. The bridge became untenable in under a minute. Evans was on the bridge when the 6-inch shells hit. When Hagen reached him, Evans was standing bareheaded and bare-chested. The concussion had blown away his helmet. The fires had burned most of his shirt off. His left hand was wrapped in a handkerchief he had tied himself. 2 fingers were gone. Blood had soaked through the cloth to his wrist. He was already shouting orders. A squall line was close, a low band of rain, and reduced visibility moving across the engagement area. Evans drove Johnston into it. The Japanese lost visual contact. For 15 minutes, inside the rain, the crew worked. Men rerouted electrical power around destroyed circuits. Damage control parties shored up flooding compartments. The engineering watch held the remaining boiler at full pressure in spaces where the heat from intact machinery and the fires burning in adjacent compartments had produced temperatures that no thermometer aboard was positioned to record. 15 minutes. Then Evans brought Johnston back out of the squall. She was no longer the ship she had been. One engine, 3 rear gun mounts without power, no torpedoes, no radar. Steering controlled not from the bridge but from the fantail. Evans shouting orders down through an open hatch to men turning the rudder by hand in the compartment below. Half her designed speed. On fire at multiple points. Evans turned back toward the Japanese fleet. For the next hour, Johnston did the work of a ship that was not crippled and not out of ammunition and not steering by men cranking a wheel by hand below the fantail. She found the Japanese destroyer force maneuvering for a torpedo attack on the escort carriers and put herself in the way. She opened fire on a Congo-class battleship at 7,000 yards with 2 functioning 5-inch guns. She put herself between a Japanese cruiser and the carrier Gambier Bay, which was already burning and listing from direct hits. It was during Gambier Bay's last minutes that Evans gave the order Hagen later called the most courageous he had ever heard. "Commence firing on that cruiser, Hagen. Draw her fire on us and away from Gambier Bay." Gambier Bay sank anyway. Johnston could not stop that. But the cruiser's guns were on Johnston for those last minutes, not on the men abandoning the carrier. By 9:30, Johnston was dead in the water, both engines gone. All gun mounts either destroyed or out of ammunition. The Japanese had formed what Hagen described as a sort of running semicircle around our ship, shooting at us like a bunch of Indians attacking a prairie schooner. They were firing from 3 directions simultaneously into a ship that could no longer maneuver, no longer shoot back, no longer do anything except absorb. At 9:45, Evans gave the order to abandon ship. Hagen wrote it plainly. At 9:45, he gave the saddest order a captain can give. 25 minutes later, at 10:10, Johnston rolled over and began to sink by the bow. A Japanese destroyer closed to 1,000 yards and fired a final round to make certain she went down. Then something happened that no one on the rafts had expected. The Japanese destroyer did not leave. It slowed. The crew came to attention on deck. An officer, described by survivor Clint Carter as a smartly dressed officer on the wing of the bridge, stood and saluted. Not a quick motion. A held salute, directed at the oil slick and debris field that was all that remained of Johnston on the surface of the Philippine Sea. The salute was ordered by that destroyer's captain, confirmed afterward by Japanese accounts of the battle. Survivor Bill Mercer, watching from a floater net, said, "We all watched as our home for the past year slowly slid below the surface. Of the 327 men aboard Johnston on the morning of October 25th, 186 did not survive." The number breaks into 3 categories. The categories matter. Approximately 50 were killed by enemy fire during the battle. 45 more died on the rafts from wounds sustained during the engagement, wounds that Johnston's single medical officer and 2 pharmacists' mates had no means of treating adequately in the middle of a 3-hour surface action. These men were alive when Johnston went down. They were dead before rescue arrived. 92, including Evans, were alive in the water after the sinking. They were never found. The 141 men who did reach rafts and floater nets spent 52 hours in the Philippine Sea before rescue ships from Leyte Gulf reached them. 52 hours. In water where Japanese aircraft strafed the rafts on the second day. In water where the sharks drawn to 300 men's worth of blood and fuel oil were present and active throughout. Without food. Without fresh water. With wounds, the salt water complicated, and the tropical sun burned open again each morning. The Navy's rescue doctrine for destroyer crews in combat conditions was, in practical terms, not a doctrine at all. The surviving warships had orders to maintain station and continue the mission. Stopping to rescue men from a sunken destroyer risked the surviving ships to submarine attack and violated tactical formation integrity. The men in the water had to manage until rescue was possible, which was not the same thing as rescue being imminent. 92 men who were alive and swimming after Johnston sank were simply gone by the time ships arrived. The accounting offered afterward, sharks, exposure, dehydration, wounds, was accurate as a list of mechanisms. It did not capture what those 52 hours produced for the men on the rafts. That part does not appear in official documents. Official documents do not have a category for it. One of the men on those rafts was Seaman First Class Jerome Surdam of Binghamton, New York. He was 19 years old on the morning of October 25th. He had reported aboard Johnston 7 months earlier, straight from training, assigned to the ammunition handling crew below decks for the forward gun mounts. During the battle, his station was inside the ship. He did not see the Japanese fleet. He saw the inside of a handling room, shells coming down the chute from the magazine on one side, going up to the mount on the other, and felt everything happening above him arrive as concussion through the steel deck beneath his boots. When the 14-inch shells from Congo struck, the deck jumped hard enough to throw a man off his feet. He got back up. He kept passing shells. When the abandoned ship order came at 9:45, Surdam was in the water within 3 minutes. On a floater net within 10. He spent 52 hours on that net. What happened on the net is documented in one place, a single recorded session from a Veterans of Foreign Wars oral history project conducted in Binghamton in 1991, when Surdam was 66 years old. The interviewer asked him what he remembered most about those 52 hours. He did not answer immediately. He said there was a man on the net named Kowalski. He didn't remember the first name, just Kowalski, who had a bad stomach wound from the battle and who everyone on the net understood was not going to make it to the rescue ships. On the second night, Kowalski stopped making sense when he talked. By the morning of the third day, he had stopped talking altogether, but was still conscious, still looking at the people around him. Surdam held Kowalski's hand for the last 4 hours. Not because anyone asked him to. Not because it was going to change anything. Because Kowalski was looking at whoever was closest. And Surdam was closest. And he was not going to look away from a man who was looking at him. He said Kowalski died at approximately 10 in the morning on the second day. He said he knew the exact time because he had been watching the sun move across the sky as a way of tracking how long they had been in the water, and he had noted where the sun was when Kowalski's hand stopped gripping back. He kept holding the hand for another 20 minutes, because he was not entirely certain. and he was not going to make that determination alone. After the war, Jerome Surdom went home to Binghamton and drove a delivery truck for 31 years. He married in 1948. He had 4 children. His family said he never spoke about the 52 hours in specific terms. Not to his wife, not to his children, not to anyone outside the VFW session where the interviewer had asked him directly. What he did do, every year without exception, until his health no longer permitted it, was drive to the Naval Memorial in Washington on October 25th. Not for a ceremony, not with a group. Alone, in his truck, in whatever weather October produced, to stand for a while and then drive back. His daughter asked him once, she was an adult by then, old enough to ask directly, what he thought about when he stood there. He said he thought about Kowalski. He said he thought about the other men who had been on the net who were not there anymore. He thought about Evans, who had been in the water somewhere that morning too, somewhere in the same Philippine Sea, and who had not been found. And he thought about what Johnston had looked like from the water after she went down. The oil spreading out, the debris, the way the slick caught the morning light and then flattened, and then became indistinguishable from the ocean around it. He said it looked very small from where he was. The slick. Much smaller than he expected a ship to look when it was gone. He said he had never entirely made peace with how small it looked. Jerome Surdom died in 2006 at the age of 81. His daughter donated his service records and photographs to the Broome County Veterans Memorial. Among them was one photograph of Johnston at sea, taken by a crew member somewhere in the spring of 1944, the ship running at speed in calm water, bow wave clean on both sides, hull number 557 visible on the bow. He had kept that photograph for 62 years. USS Johnston now rests at 21,180 feet below the surface of the Philippine Sea. The deepest confirmed warship wreck in the world. Found in 2021. Hull upright. Number 557 still visible on the bow plate, exactly as it was on the morning she was commissioned at Tacoma. 2 5-inch gun turrets remain in position. The torpedo racks. The gun mounts. 376 feet of steel sitting on the floor of the Philippine Sea exactly as she settled on the morning she went down. The Japanese officer who saluted her knew what he was looking at. 1 destroyer against 4 battleships and 6 heavy cruisers. 2 hours and 33 minutes, until there was nothing left to fight with. If this story meant something to you, hit like and subscribe. Every subscriber helps this channel keep telling the stories that deserve to be remembered.